So this movie got more publicity for being part of a parody joke on SCTV than it ever got at the box office. Even though it featured the great Sean Connery in it, the plot made no sense, and the although it was directed by the great Richard Lester, it basically meant people meant to say, who was asking for a movie like this? It's called Cuba. Now, this 1979 American adventure thriller film, again directed by Lester and starring Connery, it portrayed the build-up to the '58 Cuban Revolution, filmed in Panavision. Neil Senard of his book The Films of Richard Lester, wrote that the production, developed originally out of an idea of Lester's own, was inspired by a conversation with a friend about great modern leaders. From there, Lester's thoughts began to formulate in complex ways around Castro and Casablanca, and out of that audaciously bizarre combination comes Cuba. Now, co-starring Brooke Adams, Jack Weston, Hector Lozadano, Denham Elliott, Martin Balsam, Chris Sarandon, Alejandro Rey, and Loretta McKee. Cinematography by David Watkin, edited by John Victor Smith. Music by Patrick Williams. Again, the Technicolor process. Production company Holby, distributed by UA. 122 minutes. A budget of only $7 million, but didn't make back that even close to it at $5.6 million at the returns. Now, in this one, in the late 1950s, former British major and mercenary Robert Dapes, played by Connery, arrives in Cuba under General Bilo Martin Balsam, who orders as part of the dictator Fulgencio Batista's forces. He is to train the Cuban army to resist Castro's revolt. Before he even begins his task, he encounters an old flame, Alexander Lopez de Pulido, played by Brooke Adams, who he repeatedly pursues. The plot winds around the tremendous wealth of the Cuban leaders, the mainly American tourists with their seemingly endless money, the poverty-stricken and ex-urban slums where many Cubans live, and a rum and cigar factory owned by Alexandra's selfish husband, Juan Pulido, played by Chris Sarandon, and managed by Alexandra. When Alexandra's husband takes her out and expects her to drink with a potential factory investor and his prostitute, she leaves the restaurant and meets Robert. Furious with her husband, she spends time with Robert, reminiscing about their affair in North Africa when she was 15 and he was 30. They go to a motel and make love. They care for one another, but Robert will not stay in Cuba. The following day, the Cuban workers strike, including those at Alexandra's factory. Robert is taken captive by several Cuban rebels who lead an attack against a military facility. Robert escapes and, alienated with the corrupt Cuban government that has come to loathe, aids the rebels in defeating the government troops. Alexandra watches events pass by, believing life will soon return to normal. Robert begs her to leave, either be with him or simply to escape Cuba. She refuses. Alex's husband is killed by the same Cuban rebel who stalked Robert throughout the film. Ultimately, Robert, not seeing Alexandra at the airport, boards the aircraft to escape with other foreigners. Meanwhile, Alexandra is present outside the fence, weeping as she watched Robert board the aircraft. Robert and most of the other American, British, and wealthy Cubans flee from Cuba as Fidel comes to power, while Alexandra remains behind alone to face an unknown future under the new communist government. And this is the reverse of the Casablanca end scene. Now, a very interesting cast, and David Rappaport is in this as well, playing one of the key characters called Jesus. Now, the production, it was shot actually in Spain in December of '78. The same historical events were featured 5 years earlier in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather Part 2, and would be covered again by Sidney Pollack in his 1990 film Havana, starring the great Robert Redford. Lester's film was perhaps the most stylish of the three, aided by its stirring Spanish locations with a marvelous sense of atmosphere. Diana Ross actually was offered a female lead but turned it down. Brooke Adams, who had just received acclaim for Days of Heaven and would do well in the Dead Zone and the remake of the horror thriller Invasion of the Body Snatchers, was cast instead. Now, the aircraft in Cuba are a very, very interesting group of flyers. A Douglas DC-6B, a Dornier Do 27, a North American TB-25N Mitchell, a Douglas C-54A Skymaster, and a Lockheed C-134 Hercules. And the aircraft shown were, again, very popular amongst air aficionados. Now, Cuba was really lambasted by the critics, received negative reviews from all the major groups, with the exception of the Hollywood Reporter. In the December 1879 review there, it praised the film's sense of authenticity of place and a skillful intercutting of newsreel footage. While some critics mentioned the film's pro-Castro stance, the reviewer explained that the picture, while taking no position on Cuba today, makes appallingly clear the conditions that made Castro revolution inevitable. Another positive review came from film historian Leonard Maltin, who noted director Lester is in pretty good form with most scenes punctuated by throwaway bits. Now, I do remember this movie being at the theaters for 1 week, and releasing this at Christmas wasn't really, what do you call a Christmas movie? Did you really want to see Casablanca on the big screen with Sean Connery and Brooke Adams? Because that's pretty well what it ends up to be. Now, the review of Cuba of Vincent Canby in the New York Times was more typical of the critical responses. He wrote that Lester's Cuba was set in the island nation in 58, in the weeks immediately preceding the triumph of Castro's revolution, but it's a straight-forward-faced romance melodrama that's almost as lunatic as Mr. Lester's Help and How He Won the War, both written by Charles Wood, who also wrote the screenplay for the new film. I can't help but suspect that at some point during the production, which was shot in Spain, Mr. Lester and his associates decided there was absolutely no way to realize the Harold Robbins-like potential of the story and chose instead to make a film that is crazy fantasy about old-time Hollywood melodramas. Now, film critic Leslie Halliwell in Leslie Halliwell's Film Guide in '89 similarly reviewed Cuba, declaring it was an aimless romantic melodrama which gets absolutely nowhere and might have been better played in a Casablanca vein. Now, to many, there's a little bit of problem with the movie because of historical inaccuracy. According to one published report, the film's sense of historical accuracy is marred by the opening scene, which shows an airliner landing in Havana with the wrong date, 1959, superimposed on the screen. It should read 1958, the last year of the revolution. Cuban President Batista fled the capital on New Year's Day 59, 1 week before Fidel Castro and his guerrillas entered Havana. Now, you see in Godfather 2, they keep the chronological aspects better. Now, Sean Connery was a workmanlike actor, just like Michael Caine. He would do movies for the pay. But this movie, I don't think people made a lot of money on it. I think with Richard Lester, he was so well regarded in the UK and American film industry that Richard Lester would come and do a movie, sort of like a poor man Steven Spielberg. He would do it because what he did. Lester made some really good movies, what he called in Brit film history. So I've never seen Cuba all the way through. I've seen some previews, and all I can say if it's the previews, you're not missing anything by not getting on a plane and watching Cuba. But this is kind of weird because the 20th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution could have been played up like crazy, but it wasn't. There didn't seem to be that many articles on the movie or of the the historical significance. And I can tell you, I've never heard Cuba being shown in any streaming service. So if you've seen Cuba on a small screen in a streaming service, let me know, because it kind of is one of the disappeared movies of the 1970s, just like that John Travolta, Lily Tomlin romantic movie, moment by moment, or moment to moment, whatever it's called. In Rabbit Test with Billy Crystal. When's the last time you saw Rabbit Test on TV? Thanks for listening. Bye.